Rachel Moore had never imagined that her quiet attempt at recovery would unravel into a community spectacle. Months earlier, she had been on an operating table, doctors stitching together the fragile rhythm of her heart, wiring her future to a sleek, medical-grade biometric monitor that now wrapped securely across her chest like a second skin. The device wasn't optional. It was her lifeline, constantly tracking fluctuations, alerting her care team of any abnormalities in her rhythm. Without it, she wasn't just at risk, she was vulnerable in ways most people couldn't understand. So when her sister Julia offered to purchase a townhouse in a supposedly secure and peaceful community while Rachel recovered, she accepted. The place was tidy, regulated, clean. Every lawn was trimmed identically, mailboxes aligned like obedient soldiers, and not a single child's toy was left unguarded on any driveway. It was the kind of place where people waved, but only with their fingers, and only when others were looking. Rachel wasn't there to socialize. She didn't host gatherings, didn't bake casseroles for potlucks, and she certainly didn't gossip by the mailbox cluster with the others. Her priority was getting better physically, mentally, and emotionally. Her days were structured and solitary. Morning walks around the neighborhood, breathing in the scent of precisely fertilized grass, afternoon stretches by the living room window, and quiet evenings with a book in hand. The monitor remained discreet, tucked beneath lightweight athletic tops or linen blouses. Still, it blinked occasionally, a subtle green pulse on the upper chest strap, and its visibility couldn't be completely avoided in the sweltering heat of spring. She noticed the stares. She felt them before she ever saw them. Women squinting as she passed, mouths slightly open as if trying to place what they were seeing. And among them was one whose interest wasn't simply idle curiosity. Karen Whitley introduced herself with the sticky sweetness of a woman used to commanding the attention of PTA meetings, charity auctions, and every homeowner vote that mattered. She appeared suddenly one morning, materializing beside Rachel at the communal mailbox, as if summoned by the scent of new blood. Rachel nodded politely, already sensing the performative energy radiating from the woman's posture. Karen's eyes flicked down toward Rachel's chest, lingered a beat too long, then lifted again with an artificial smile. "That's quite the contraption you've got there," she said lightly, as though discussing a smartwatch. "My son thought it was some kind of augmented reality thing." "You know kids these days," Rachel, not unkindly, explained its purpose. Medical necessity, cardiac monitoring, post-op care. She kept it simple. She always did. Karen made a soft cooing sound, the kind people use when pretending to empathize. "Oh, bless your heart," she said. "But really, I think some of the other parents might be concerned. It's a bit conspicuous, you know. Maybe you could keep it more private for the children." Rachel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her silence only seemed to encourage Karen, who patted her on the arm with mock affection before striding off, her tone cheery as she called out over her shoulder, "Looking forward to seeing you at the Saturday picnic. Bring something fun." Rachel didn't plan to attend, but Julia insisted. "You've been isolating too much," she said over the phone. "Just go, make an appearance, grab a plate of something and leave. Show them you're not weird. Show them you're human." So Rachel went. She put on a pale blue dress that was loose enough to accommodate the monitor and spent half an hour psyching herself up in front of the mirror. By the time she stepped onto the community lawn, lined with folding tables and plastic chairs, she felt like an exhibit. The whispers weren't obvious, but they were there. She could read lips now. That's her medical thing, weird, sad. She found an empty spot near the edge, away from the crowd, and picked at a slice of watermelon, eyes scanning for a reason to leave without being noticed. That was when the boy appeared. He was maybe 8, wiry and restless, the type who couldn't sit still even when exhausted. He stared directly at Rachel's chest, wide-eyed, then pointed. "That's it," he yelled. "I saw it first. That's mine." Before Rachel could process the words, the boy rushed her, hands grabbing at her top. "Mom, she stole it. That's the thing. That's the one." Rachel staggered back in shock, trying to shield the device, but he was too quick. His small fingers fumbled with the chest strap, pulling it free just enough to expose the blinking panel. "Jeremy." Karen's voice rang out like a dinner bell. "Jeremy, come here. What did I tell you about shouting?" She swept over, all tanned arms and floral perfume, and without hesitation reached out, gripped the strap of Rachel's monitor, and yanked it fully from her chest. "He said he saw it first," Karen declared with an infuriating smirk, holding the monitor up like a prize ribbon. "He thought it was a toy. You should have known better than to wear something like this around children." Rachel stood frozen, the sudden exposure of her chest less humiliating than the panic setting in. Her heart thudded once wrong, then again worse. Her body was reacting to the removal of the monitor. She could feel the electrical tension in her sternum spike. She reached out, gasping, not even for the device, but for air. "I need that back." Karen, oblivious or indifferent, had already turned, handing the monitor to her son, who dropped it almost immediately in the grass and wandered off. The next thing Rachel knew, her knees buckled. A neighbor caught her before she hit the ground. Someone shouted. Someone else ran to call for help. The last thing she saw before her vision narrowed to a pinpoint was Karen's face, leaning over her with that same empty sympathy she'd worn days earlier. "You really should take better care of yourself," she whispered. "People are watching." When she woke up, she was in a hospital bed, hooked up to real monitors now, the kind you can't take home. Julia was beside her, white-knuckled and livid. Rachel wanted to ask what had happened to the device, but the look in Julia's eyes answered that question. Destroyed. Unusable. The EMT had found it trampled near the watermelon table. "You're lucky they got to you in time," the nurse had said. "That monitor might have been the only reason you didn't flatline on the grass." Rachel was discharged the next afternoon with a backup monitor, bulkier, older, less responsive. A temporary fix. The manufacturer said it would be weeks before a replacement for the original could be programmed and delivered. And in that span of time, Rachel realized something far more chilling than the health scare itself. No one in the community, apart from Julia, had reached out. Not one person asked if she was okay. No one offered support. In fact, when Rachel finally ventured outside to check her mail again, she saw the flyer. Taped to the communal board, beside announcements for garage sales and lost pets, was a printed statement from Karen. Concerning the recent incident, it read, "Residents are reminded to consider their neighbors and avoid wearing devices or accessories that may alarm or confuse children. Let's maintain the peaceful and visually appropriate environment we all agreed to." Beneath it were signatures. 8 of them, including 2 people who had been present that day, people who had seen her collapse, people who had chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. Rachel stared at the flyer for a long time, heart hammering not from fear but from something else, something colder, heavier, more permanent. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Rachel didn't leave her townhouse for the next 48 hours. The shock hadn't worn off, neither physical nor emotional. The pain from the incident at the picnic still lingered in her chest, not just as a dull throb beneath the new monitor, but as something deeper, more penetrating. It wasn't the trauma of losing consciousness in public that disturbed her most, but the fact that no one seemed to see it for what it truly was, a violation. A physical assault disguised as a misunderstanding. The silence from her neighbors, the absence of apology, of even a passing acknowledgement, stung far more than Karen's hand ripping the monitor from her body. Julia was furious, naturally, but Rachel had asked her not to confront anyone, not yet. They needed facts, records, documentation. She wasn't going to scream into a void. She wanted action. Measurable, legal, documented action. The first step was her health insurance provider. She filed a formal incident report that same day, attaching photos of the damaged device, the emergency care summary from the hospital, and a detailed recounting of the incident. Her primary care physician had to submit confirmation that the biometric monitor was required for continuous cardiac monitoring post-surgery. Then came the second step, contacting the manufacturer. They were sympathetic but methodical, as companies like that tend to be. Yes, they would replace the device. No, it wouldn't be immediate. They had to build a new one to her specific calibration, and it would take 10 business days minimum. In the meantime, she'd have to make do with the temporary model, clunky, sensitive, and prone to false alarms. And then came the third step, the one she dreaded the most. She requested a meeting with the residential management office. Not because she thought they'd be helpful, but because she needed it on record that she had attempted to resolve the matter through appropriate channels. When she walked into the office the next morning, she was met not by the property manager whom she'd spoken to once upon moving in, but by someone new. A man in a pale suit, with slicked hair and a smile too quick to form. He introduced himself as Logan, Resident Relations Coordinator, which Rachel immediately translated in her mind as Damage Control Specialist. She explained what had happened in precise, neutral language, presenting both the hospital summary and the insurer's report. Logan listened politely, fingers tented on the desk, nodding at all the appropriate moments, but his eyes remained oddly disengaged, drifting now and then to the corner of the room or the clock above the door. When she finished, he leaned back slightly and said, "That sounds difficult. I'm sorry you experienced that." Rachel blinked. It wasn't an experience. It was battery. Logan shifted uncomfortably, then reached for a yellow folder beside him. "Look, MS Moore. We've actually already received communication regarding the incident. MS Whitley has submitted a statement as well, and well, as with all disagreements between residents, we need to remain neutral while we investigate." Rachel tilted her head. "Neutral?" She physically grabbed a medical device off my chest. Logan opened the folder. According to MS Whitley's version of events, it was an unfortunate misunderstanding. She claims her son believed your device was a tech toy, and that she tried to retrieve it to prevent further confusion. She also mentions that you may have overreacted. Rachel stared at him. "Overreacted?" I collapsed. "Paramedics took me away." Logan nodded, as if this somehow supported her point, while simultaneously dismissing it. "We take all health-related concerns seriously, which is why we've initiated a community review. But I do need to inform you," he hesitated, then slid a printed notice across the table. "There have also been complaints filed regarding the visibility of your equipment. Some residents feel it's unsettling to children." Rachel picked up the notice. "So now I'm being reprimanded for being medically compromised?" Logan raised both palms. "It's not a reprimand. It's a suggestion to consider more discreet clothing when in shared spaces, just for the time being." She left the office without responding, the paper crumpled in her fist, her skin crawling. It wasn't just that Karen had violated her boundaries, it was that the system she lived within saw that violation as a gray area, something to mediate, as if morality and legality were matters of collective comfort. That afternoon, her mailbox contained a second surprise. A small, unmarked envelope. Inside, a printed photo, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed her walking along the sidewalk, monitor visible under her thin exercise top. A red circle had been drawn around the blinking green light. No note, no return address, just the image. A message clear enough in its threat. She sat down at her kitchen table, fingers tightening around the edge. It had escalated. This wasn't idle gossip. It wasn't even a passive-aggressive swipe at her lifestyle. This was targeted, deliberate. Someone wanted her afraid, isolated, gone. Julia, when told, wanted to call the police immediately. Rachel hesitated. The photo alone wasn't enough for action. It could have been left by anyone, even one of the children. And besides, she wasn't going to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. Not yet. Instead, she began documenting everything. She photographed the mailbox. She scanned the management notice and the community complaints. She updated the insurance claim with the harassment details. She began printing hard copies of every email. And most of all, she kept her movements limited, her presence quiet, waiting to see what Karen would do next. It didn't take long. 3 days later, on a mild Thursday morning, Rachel stepped outside to water her small backyard garden, one of the few joys she'd cultivated since moving in. As she knelt beside the flower bed, a voice drifted over the fence, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "You know, my Jeremy still isn't sleeping right. Keeps asking why the lady with the alien armor was yelling at him." Rachel didn't answer. Karen's tone shifted. "It's a shame, really. This used to be such a calm place. And now people are nervous. Some of us have been talking." Rachel stood slowly, turning to face the fence, though she couldn't see over it. "If you have something to say to me, Karen, say it directly." There was a pause, followed by a slight laugh. "I don't need to. I've already said what matters to the people who matter. You're just a guest here, Rachel. A visitor. Temporary. And people like you don't stay long." Rachel walked back inside without a word, jaw clenched, stomach churning. The next day, a landscaping crew arrived. They weren't her crew. She hadn't hired them. But they began trimming the shared hedges between her property and Karen's. One of them, a teenager, accidentally knocked over one of Rachel's ceramic planters. When she asked who had sent them, they shrugged. "Whitley, I think," said the area needed tidying. Rachel called the management office. Logan wasn't available. The receptionist promised to look into it. Hours passed. No call back. That night, Rachel heard scratching at her front door. When she turned on the porch light, no one was there, but her welcome mat was gone, replaced with a new one. It read, "Smile. You're part of the neighborhood." She stood staring at it for a long time, heartbeat unsteady beneath the foreign weight of the temporary monitor. Then, quietly, she stepped inside, locked the door, and began writing her own complaint. Not to the complex, not to Karen, but to the state's Board of Community Living Oversight, along with a copy of her insurer's official incident claim. She wasn't shouting yet, but she was loading the chamber, because this wasn't petty anymore. It was war, and she was done being quiet. By the time the formal letter arrived printed on heavy ivory cardstock and sealed with the gold insignia of the neighborhood board, Rachel was already expecting it. The envelope had the sterile, pretentious look of something that pretended to be official but lacked the weight of actual law. She opened it slowly, almost with reverence, not because she feared what it would say, but because she already knew. The letter was a summons, carefully worded as an invitation to a board meeting regarding recent behavioral incidents involving multiple residents. The language was vague but heavily coded. She read the phrases twice: ongoing disruption, concerns raised, mutual responsibility to uphold the peaceful nature of our community. Not once did the letter mention the assault, the medical emergency, or the harassment that had followed. It simply framed her as part of an unfortunate conflict, as if she were just as responsible for the chaos as the woman who had ripped a medical device from her body. Julia wanted her to ignore the meeting, to file a lawsuit and be done with it. But Rachel insisted on going. "If I don't show up, they'll paint me as unstable," she said. Or worse, guilty. And so, on the day of the meeting, she dressed with clinical precision, neutral slacks, a pale blouse, and a lightweight sweater that concealed the temporary monitor but did nothing to hide the lines of fatigue on her face. Her hair was tied back, her makeup minimal. She wasn't there to charm anyone. She was there to witness the system that enabled people like Karen and record how they twisted truth into community policy. The board convened in a small hall behind the community clubhouse, a sterile space that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and plastic chairs. A half circle of folding tables had been arranged at the front of the room, behind which sat 6 members of the board, all volunteers, all carefully neutral in posture and expression. Karen was not among them, but Rachel saw her seated in the second row of the audience, legs crossed, lips pursed in a faint smile. She looked calm, confident, like a woman who had already rehearsed the outcome in her head. The chairwoman, a tired-looking woman named Denise, opened the meeting with a statement about shared responsibility and community well-being. She acknowledged that there had been uncomfortable interactions and that the board was committed to resolving tension with fairness and objectivity. Then she looked at Rachel and asked her to speak. Rachel stood slowly, her pulse thudding in her ears, and delivered a concise, unwavering account of what had occurred. She spoke clearly without emotion, letting the facts stand on their own: the removal of the monitor, the hospitalization, the photographic threat, the unauthorized landscaping, the mocking flyer. She had copies of everything in a folder, which she offered to the board. Only 2 of them accepted the papers. The others simply nodded. When she finished, Denise thanked her, then turned to Karen and invited her to respond. Karen stood, straightened her blouse, and spoke with a soothing, maternal cadence. "Let me begin by saying how deeply sorry I am that Ms. Moore felt unsafe. That's never what anyone in this community wants. But I think we also have to be honest about perception. Children are sensitive. Residents have expressed concern not about her condition. Of course not, but about the way certain devices appear. And in times like these, with everything going on in the world, we must be mindful of what we bring into shared spaces." Rachel stared at her, barely registering the words. She saw the same manipulation she'd seen at the mailbox weeks ago, repackaged now for an audience. Karen wasn't trying to prove anything. She was performing, calibrating her tone, choosing her words carefully, like someone who'd spent years learning which lies sounded like concern. The board thanked both women and said they would deliberate on the matter. The meeting moved on to tree maintenance, roof color disputes, and community potluck dates. Rachel sat through it all, back stiff, hands folded in her lap. As she left the hall, she heard Karen's voice behind her. "No hard feelings, I hope. We all just want what's best for the neighborhood." Rachel didn't turn around. The next week was a blur of stress and shallow breathing. The temporary monitor was oversensitive, triggering false alarms every time her heart rate climbed during her evening walks. She couldn't sleep properly, couldn't concentrate on the remote consulting work she had taken on to stay financially independent during her recovery. Every day brought new petty offenses: trash bins overturned, her garden hose twisted into knots, pebbles scattered deliberately across her walkway. Small things, impossible to trace, but constant, relentless. Julia began sleeping on the couch some nights, unwilling to leave Rachel alone after dark. And then came the mail theft. A neighbor named Lydia knocked on Rachel's door, holding a torn piece of cardboard and a padded envelope. "I found this in the community trash bin," she said awkwardly. "It was addressed to you. Thought you'd want to know." Inside had been a new medication shipment, one Rachel had been waiting on for over a week. It was still sealed, but the label had been peeled off and reapplied. Someone had opened it, then reassembled the box badly. She reported it immediately. The postal office filed a complaint. Nothing happened. At night, she kept the lights low and her phone nearby. Her eyes burned from scrolling through forums about medical privacy laws, patient rights, and harassment documentation. And somewhere in the fog of those sleepless hours, she realized something had shifted inside her: not fear, not even anger, but a cold resolve. She wasn't going to wait for justice. She was going to build a paper wall so high around her that Karen couldn't touch it. Reports, records, correspondences, everything dated and notarized. She contacted a local patient advocacy group, explained her situation in measured, calm terms, and was assigned an advocate, an older woman named Val, who had once worked in elder care litigation, and sales law, now volunteered to help individuals like Rachel navigate harassment tied to disability or medical status. Val was efficient, experienced, and reassuring. "They think you're an easy target," she said over the phone. "They think you're alone. But you're not. They messed with the wrong kind of quiet." Rachel smiled faintly at that. It was the first time in weeks she felt like she was allowed to stand upright. Together, they began preparing a formal demand letter, not just for replacement of damaged equipment and emotional distress, but but for the community board to acknowledge their failure to enforce protection policies for medically at-risk residents. The letter would go through legal channels, CC'd to the Residential Oversight Agency and 2 public health organizations. Rachel didn't expect it to bring resolution, but it would be a warning shot. And she had no intention of missing. The letter was sent on a Monday, hand-delivered by courier and electronically submitted through the proper legal portal. It was meticulous, not aggressive, but unshakable in its logic, fortified by documentation, medical records, insurance correspondence, and formal witness statements, including one from the neighbor Lydia, who had found Rachel's stolen mail in the trash. Rachel had reviewed every sentence with Val, who made sure the tone was irrefutably calm and professional, a blend of legal precision and human weight that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a threat, it was a line in the sand. For 2 days there was silence. Then came the response, not from the board, not from Karen directly, but from the neighborhood listserv, that subtle engine of community propaganda dressed as open communication. An anonymous post appeared under the subject line "Privacy and Perception." It spoke vaguely of recent events involving medical devices, and how some residents were concerned about the emotional safety of children when confronted with unfamiliar or intimidating appearances. The post never named Rachel, but the subtext was surgical. It called for a more cohesive visual standard and a return to the peaceful aesthetic that had once defined the community. The final sentence read, "Let us not forget that shared spaces are shared experiences, and no one has the right to disrupt the harmony we've built." The replies trickled in with passive approval. "Well said. Agreed. Let's stay united." A few voices tried to question the intent, but they were quickly drowned in a wave of veiled etiquette and performative unity. Rachel read every word without blinking, jaw tight, pulse steady. Karen was using the system not to defend herself, but to erase Rachel's right to exist visibly. That was the game now, not harassment, but assimilation. She was being told to disappear quietly, to remove anything that reminded the others that bodies break down, that illness doesn't care about neighborhood guidelines, and that one blinking light could unsettle the artificial peace more than any loud party or barking dog. That Friday, Rachel received an unexpected call. The board had scheduled a follow-up session, not a hearing, not a disciplinary meeting, but a community dialogue where residents could air their concerns and rebuild trust. Rachel hesitated before accepting. Val warned her it was a trap, a performative spectacle designed to force her into an emotional outburst. But Rachel understood something deeper. The real audience wasn't the board or Karen, it was the community. A silent majority, the ones who hadn't spoken up, who weren't cruel but weren't brave either. She needed to look them in the eye, not to persuade them, but to remind them that she saw them watching. The session was held outdoors, in a half-circle of chairs on the community green, under strings of polite fairy lights, and with lukewarm lemonade in plastic cups. Rachel arrived early and sat near the center, her posture upright, her face unreadable. Karen came late, of course, flanked by 2 other women from the social committee, both dressed in pastel colors, all with that same pleasant tension around the mouth that said they were already planning how to weaponize whatever was about to happen. The board opened the session with warm words: unity, neighborliness, understanding. Then they asked if anyone would like to begin. Karen stood first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even sound accusatory. Instead, she sounded wounded. "It's been a hard few weeks," she said, eyes sweeping the circle as if begging for recognition. "And I think we've all felt the tension. No one wants to see anyone hurt. But I have to say, I've felt unsafe too. When someone walks through a family neighborhood wearing devices that flash, that beep, that look military, it's frightening for children. And for some of us adults as well. I've had nightmares about the day my son screamed. I've had to explain things to him I never thought I'd have to. It's changed how I feel in my own home." Rachel said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence around the circle grew thick. Then someone else spoke, a man in his 70s, previously unknown to Rachel. I was in Vietnam, he said flatly. You think a medical vest is scary? Try a body bag. That woman's trying to stay alive. You don't like how it looks? Don't look. Karen flushed, but the board quickly redirected. Let's keep this constructive, Denise said. Rachel finally stood. She didn't bring notes. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, I didn't choose this device. It was prescribed to keep my heart from stopping. I didn't choose to have it ripped off in public. I didn't choose to be photographed, to have my mail stolen, to be watched from across the street. But I do choose to stay here, and I choose to keep surviving in the way my doctors told me to. If that upsets someone's aesthetic sense of calm, that's a problem for their conscience. Not mine. She sat back down. No applause followed. But no one spoke either. Later that evening, as the chairs were folded and the lemonade dumped, one of the board members approached her quietly. A woman named Sharon, always silent during meetings. Thank you, she said softly. That needed to be said. Rachel nodded, not smiling. She didn't need gratitude. She needed space to breathe. But in that moment, she realized the battle had changed. It was no longer about silencing her. Now Karen had to discredit her completely or risk losing the audience she'd carefully cultivated. And Rachel knew exactly what Karen would do next. Rachel had expected retaliation. What she hadn't expected was how quickly it came or how thoroughly it bypassed all forms of decency. 3 days after the so-called community dialogue, she received a letter slipped not into her mailbox, but into the narrow crack between her front door and its frame, as if whoever delivered it couldn't be bothered to use the postal service or even the courtesy of knocking. The letter wasn't from the board this time. It was from a city compliance office, bearing a generic municipal logo and stamped with the words Notice of Property Review. According to the letter, a complaint had been filed regarding unpermitted alterations to her property, specifically the installation of surveillance equipment without neighborhood approval. Rachel blinked at the accusation. She didn't even have visible cameras. She had one small doorbell cam that came standard with the unit, and she had installed a motion detector by her garden hose after the third time it was mysteriously turned on overnight. That was it. But the letter implied that she had violated ordinances concerning optical monitoring systems visible from communal grounds, reciting vague bylaws likely dredged from decades-old clauses no one had enforced until now. She called the number listed and was connected to a woman who sounded more exhausted than hostile. It's probably a formality, the woman said, though she wouldn't confirm who had filed the complaint. We just have to come inspect. Shouldn't take more than 15 minutes. Rachel agreed, but the sick feeling in her stomach didn't dissipate. This wasn't about surveillance. It was about escalation. Karen had shifted tactics. Her public character assault had stalled in the wake of Rachel's calm statements, so now she was resorting to official mechanisms, wielding policy like a weapon, but shifting from social ostracism to legal entanglement. The inspector arrived 2 days later. A man in his early 40s, clipboard in hand, polite but distant. He walked the perimeter of Rachel's townhouse, checked the doorbell cam, asked questions about motion detectors and exterior lighting. When she explained the timeline and showed him the relevant receipts, he nodded, took photos, and said he'd file his report within the week. I wouldn't worry, he added as he left. This happens more than you'd think. Usually someone just doesn't like their neighbor. Rachel thanked him, but she didn't feel reassured. That night, the motion detector she had just defended was ripped from the wall and shattered on her doorstep. Rachel sat down and began a new file. She logged the city letter, the inspector's visit, and now the destruction of property. She updated the documentation folder Val had helped her maintain and emailed copies to her insurer, her physician, and the patient advocacy team. The next morning, she filed a police report. The officer who responded took the matter seriously, more seriously than the neighborhood ever had. He inspected the broken sensor, noted the pattern of damage, and confirmed that it hadn't simply fallen off. Looks like someone took a hammer to it, he said flatly. Got any enemies? Rachel didn't answer directly, just handed him a printout of the listserv post and the flyer Karen had authored after the picnic. He skimmed both, brow furrowing. This the same Karen everyone jokes about on Nextdoor? She nodded once. He sighed. People like her usually stop when they realize you're documenting everything. But if she doesn't, keep the cameras rolling. By the end of that week, Rachel's name was featured in a formal petition circulated through the neighborhood. The language was careful, clearly ghostwritten by someone with just enough legal awareness to dance on the edge of defamation, but its intent was unmistakable. The petition asked the board to evaluate the continued compatibility of Rachel's presence in the neighborhood due to ongoing disruptions, patterns of conflict, and repeated misuse of community systems for personal grievances. A copy was posted on the community bulletin board beside the pool. Another was taped to Rachel's garage door. When Julia tried to tear it down, two neighbors across the street watched silently from their porches, one of them sipping iced tea like it was just another summer day. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't rage. But something hardened in her that day, something like the final calcification of disappointment into purpose. She scanned the petition, highlighted every manipulative phrase, and sent it directly to Val, who responded within the hour. I forwarded it to our legal team, she wrote. This is harassment under 80 guidelines, and the language implicates coordinated retaliation. You have grounds. Meanwhile, Rachel began to notice new patterns. Her deliveries were increasingly delayed or misdirected. One morning, she found a cold bag of groceries sitting on the sidewalk a full block from her door, her name still on the receipt. Another day, a prescription was left in full sun, though the pharmacy had marked it as hand-delivered. She started receiving HOA violation notices for issues that weren't real: unapproved shrubbery height, inconsistent mailbox paint, questionable yard art. Each accusation came with a fine, small, but cumulative. When she challenged them, the board responded with vague policies and suggestions to remain neighborly and compliant. Rachel kept copies of everything, compiling a portfolio thicker than any case file she'd handled in her past consulting work. Still, the stress wore at her. She began waking at 3 a.m., her heart rhythm jagged enough to set off the temporary monitor's low-level alarm. She kept water beside the bed, along with a copy of her incident log, her insurance ID, and the emergency reset code for the device. Then came the dog. Karen's son, the same boy who had screamed, "That's mine," during the monitor incident, had now taken to walking an aggressive retriever without a leash directly past Rachel's house. The dog barked, lunged at the edge of her garden, and once urinated on the ceramic planters she had so carefully arranged. When Rachel asked him to leash the dog, he smirked and said, "Mom said he can smell fear." She reported it, of course. The board responded that pet-related disputes must be handled through mediation, not enforcement. Mediation required both parties' cooperation. Karen declined. But Rachel wasn't interested in mediation. She called animal control, filed a formal leash law complaint, and sent them video footage from her doorbell cam. 2 days later, Karen's dog was picked up, and Rachel could hear the yelling from across the cul-de-sac, Karen's voice cutting through the early evening air, shouting about fascism and neighbor betrayal. That night, Rachel's porch was egged. A single brown egg cracked on the doormat she had cleaned only hours before. When she opened the door, there was no one in sight, just a folded note tucked beneath the shattered shell. In neat cursive it read, "You don't belong here. People are watching. People have always been watching." Rachel called the police again. The officer who responded was the same as before. He examined the note, took photos, and muttered, "This woman needs a hobby." But even he looked unsettled. "You want patrols?" he asked. Rachel shook her head. "I want it documented." And she meant it. She didn't expect rescue. She expected justice, slow, methodical, paper-bound justice that would corner Karen not with confrontation but with consequence. Because this wasn't a war for sympathy anymore. It was a war of attrition. Rachel had learned to expect silence after impact. That was the pattern Karen struck. The community watched, the board wavered, and no one said a word until the dust settled. But this time, the silence cracked differently. It came not from inaction, but from something more dangerous, a calculated delay. The petition had made its rounds, but instead of quiet, Rachel began hearing things, half-sentences caught in passing, strange pauses when she entered shared spaces, sudden notifications from unfamiliar numbers. Something was shifting beneath the surface. Then came the letter, not slipped under her door, not handwritten, but emailed to her directly from the community board's legal liaison. Pending resolution inquiry. The subject read. The content was brief, a request for Rachel to attend a private mediation session regarding her ongoing conflicts with several residents, including one MS. Whitley. The date was already set. The attendance was highly advised. Rachel stared at the screen for a long time, heart steady now, not from calm but from pure emotional exhaustion. She didn't respond immediately. She called Val. They talked for over an hour. And then, quietly and without fanfare, Rachel said, "I want to go." The session took place in the board office, a space meant for garden club meetings and pool pass distribution, now transformed into a neutral battlefield. The room was laid out with absurd symmetry, 2 chairs for disputants, 2 for facilitators, and 2 board members to observe impartially. Rachel arrived first, deliberately early, dressed in muted gray with her monitor visible this time, not flashing, not dramatic, just present. Unapologetic. Karen arrived 10 minutes later, her expression tight, hair styled into aggressive precision, and a stack of papers tucked under her arm like armor. She gave Rachel a clipped smile before turning to shake hands with the facilitators. The board members nodded but didn't rise. The session began with procedural pleasantries, definitions of terms, affirmation of voluntary participation, assurance that all voices would be heard. Then came the prompt, "Please describe, in your own words, the nature of the conflict as you see it." Karen went first. Her voice, for once, was not sugary. It was clipped, purposeful, and slightly trembling with restrained outrage. She painted herself as misunderstood, claiming she had only ever acted in concern for the community, that her actions had been misinterpreted, and that she was the true target of harassment now, living in fear of being watched, recorded, and publicly shamed. She mentioned her son multiple times, emphasized his emotional distress, and at one point even pulled out a photo of the boy standing by a window looking forlorn. It was the most manipulative performance Rachel had ever seen, and she'd spent years consulting with corporate mediators who built careers on strategic deception. But she didn't interrupt. She listened. And when it was her turn, she didn't argue. She didn't counterpoint. She simply laid out the timeline, the device, the incident, the hospital, the complaint, the theft, the broken sensor, the egg, the note, the dog, the petition. She backed everything with documents, photos, names, timestamps. She made no emotional appeals, no pleas for sympathy. Only clarity. When she finished, the facilitators didn't speak for a long moment. One of them, a woman in her 50s with a visible streak of gray in her tightly coiled bun, finally asked Karen if she had a response to the photographic evidence of the broken monitor and medical documentation. Karen's face tightened. "I never meant to hurt her," she said. "It was a misunderstanding." The facilitator didn't blink. "But you admit you removed a medical device from another person's body?" Karen hesitated. "I thought it was something else. I wasn't sure what it was." "You didn't ask?" She startled me. "You reached out, grabbed the object, and removed it without permission. Is that correct?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She said nothing. The session ended 20 minutes later. No decisions were made, no rulings handed down. But Rachel left knowing something fundamental had changed. Karen had overplayed. Her performance was no longer effective. The evidence was too dense, the documentation too precise, and the facilitators, professionals trained to detect narrative manipulation, had seen through the veil. 2 days later, Rachel received an official letter from the board. It wasn't an apology. It was never going to be. But it was a statement of resolution. It acknowledged that the initial incident had involved an unacceptable breach of personal medical privacy. And while it did not assign punitive measures, it advised all residents to refrain from unsolicited physical contact, visual monitoring, or hostile commentary directed at other members of the community, particularly those with medical vulnerabilities. It also included a notice that any future complaints against Rachel would require full legal substantiation before the board would act on them. Karen's fury arrived in the form of visible unraveling. She stormed into the communal garden club meeting later that week, demanding that Rachel be banned from shared spaces for safety reasons. When reminded that the board had issued a formal statement closing the matter, she accused them of corruption. The next morning, several residents found handwritten notes in their mailboxes, warning them that Rachel was monitoring their children with unregistered equipment. Most ignored it. Some returned the notes anonymously. One woman, Lydia, knocked on Rachel's door and handed her the one she had received, her face pale but calm. "She's losing it," she said. "People see it now." But Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. The final act came 3 nights later. It was late. Rachel had just settled into bed when she heard something outside, soft but distinct. A rustling near her garden, a brief scrape against the window frame. She rose quietly, pulled on a sweatshirt, and checked the doorbell cam. The feed was dark, save for a tall shadow disappearing toward the hedge. She waited, heart steady, then stepped outside. Karen stood at the edge of the garden, holding something in her hand. A broken planter. Her eyes were wild, her breathing shallow. Rachel didn't speak. Karen took one step forward and threw the ceramic shard at her feet. It shattered with a dull crack. Then, without a word, she lunged. Rachel didn't panic. She braced her arm, deflected the first grab, and pivoted backward. They struggled for only seconds, but the motion was clumsy, frantic. Karen's hand caught the edge of the monitor strap again, but this time, Rachel didn't let go. She shoved her back, hard enough to knock Karen off balance. The older woman fell sideways into the wet mulch, panting, her blouse stained with dirt. Lights came on. Julia's voice shouted from inside. Someone across the street yelled, "What the hell is going on?" Rachel didn't move. Karen scrambled up, breathless, eyes wide, and ran. The police arrived 6 minutes later. This time they didn't ask many questions. They reviewed the footage. They took statements. And they left with Karen in the back seat of the cruiser. Rachel stood on her porch as the taillights disappeared into the dark. She was breathing hard, but her heart was steady. For once, the monitor was silent. The morning after Karen was taken away, the neighborhood felt different, not quieter, not relieved, just suspended in a kind of cautious stillness, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. No one came knocking on Rachel's door. There were no apologies, no sudden acknowledgments of wrongdoing. But there were signs, subtle ones, that the balance had shifted. The flyer about visual harmony disappeared from the bulletin board. The petition was no longer circulated. And for the first time in weeks, Rachel stepped outside to find her planters untouched, her hose coiled properly, and not a single piece of trash scattered on her walkway. People didn't speak to her, but they didn't avert their eyes anymore either. She had become part of the landscape again, not a threat, not a curiosity, just present. And that, for now, was enough. The official report filed against Karen remained confidential, but Rachel knew from the officer's follow-up that charges were being considered not just for harassment, but for physical assault and tampering with medical equipment. Rachel provided every document, every photograph, every message, and never once pushed for an outcome. She didn't need retribution. She needed record. A history that spoke in facts, not rumors, a trail of truth too detailed to bury. It would be up to the system now, and while Rachel didn't trust it completely, she had learned how to work within its boundaries. how to reinforce herself against its failures without becoming brittle or bitter. Karen's house went quiet after that night. For days, the curtains stayed closed, the porch lights off. Then one morning, a moving truck pulled up, and by the end of the day, she was gone. No goodbyes. No explanation, just absence, sudden and almost anticlimactic, as if the weight of her presence had been lifted without fanfare. A few residents gathered near the truck, murmuring among themselves, but no one offered help. Whatever power she once held had dissolved the moment she lost control of her own story. Rachel didn't celebrate. There was no triumph in watching someone unravel. But there was a slow, grounding sense of return, of finally being able to live in her own home without planning exit strategies, without bracing for the next absurd violation. She restored her original monitor once the replacement arrived, the sleek, familiar device slipping into place like a reminder of survival. She kept the documentation, of course, organized, time-stamped, filed in both digital and printed formats. She added the final police report to the archive and labeled it plainly, Resolution. Julia moved back to her own place but came by often, bringing groceries or sitting quietly in the garden while Rachel watered her plants. They didn't talk about Karen much. The story had been told enough times. What mattered now was what Rachel chose to build in the aftermath. She began speaking occasionally with the advocacy group that had supported her during the worst of it, not as a client anymore, but as a contributor, offering to review case materials or help new victims craft their own documentation. Not as a hero, not even as a mentor, just as someone who had lived through it and knew where the traps were hidden. She started going on longer walks again, past the community pool, around the dog park, through the main boulevard where children played and adults chatted about lawn treatments and delivery delays. Sometimes people nodded. Sometimes they didn't. But no one stopped her. No one stared. She was no longer the woman with the strange blinking vest. She was just Rachel again. One evening, weeks after the resolution, she found a folded note taped to her front gate, not hostile, not anonymous. Just a small, polite envelope with her name spelled correctly. Inside was a card. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up," it read. "I saw what happened. I just didn't know how to say it. I hope you stay. We need better people here." No signature, no return address, just that single line of quiet truth. Rachel didn't frame it. She didn't reply. But she kept it tucked into her folder beneath the hospital report and the photos and the final resolution letter. Not because she needed proof, but because it reminded her that silence, too, can break, sometimes late, sometimes weak, but sometimes real. And in the end, that was the only justice she had ever wanted.